Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 28 October 2025. 1,713 years ago today, on Tuesday, 28 October AD 312, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge was fought between the court forces of Constantine and Maxentius, both contending to be recognized as the emperor in the West. It could be argued that the Battle of the Milvian Bridge was one of the battles that shaped Western history, since, in his triumph in the battle, Constantine effectively secured the Western Roman Empire for himself, and then eventually went on to eventually claim the entire empire for himself and for his sons. Interestingly, the same Milvian Bridge where the battle was fought more than 17th century ago still stands and can be visited today. The bridge, you could say, has fared better than the empire. During the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was more or less on the ropes in what we now call the crisis of the 3rd century. The Emperor Diocletian brought the empire back from the brink, and he's sometimes credited with breathing another century of life into the rickety empire. Diocletian instituted a number of reforms, and one of these reforms was a large-scale reapportioning of power within the empire that changed the structure of imperial institutions. It was Diocletian who divided the empire into an eastern and a western half, but that's not all. In an attempt to ensure orderly succession, each half of the empire had an emperor and a co-emperor who was a kind of understudy. If the emperor of either half of the empire died or retired, the understudy emperor would take over and then name his own co-emperor. This meant that the Roman Empire was ruled by 4 men, and this came to be called the tetrarchy, or the rule of 4. In theory, this arrangement could have been continued indefinitely, and if Diocletian's reforms had been entirely successful, there would still be an Eastern and a Western Empire, Roman Empire today, each with an emperor and a co-emperor. In practice, it didn't work out that way. Diocletian was, we could say, the rarest of Roman empires because he actually retired rather than dying in office or being killed in office, as became increasingly common in the later Roman Empire. And he lived on several years in retirement. But as soon as he stepped down from the tetrarchy, things started to fall apart because the rivalries within the tetrarchy couldn't be controlled. The tetrarchy didn't formally allow for hereditary succession, so the son of an emperor or of any of the 4 tetrarchs had no claim on the imperial succession. Or I could say they had no legal claim on the imperial succession, but they had a familial claim, and human beings being what they are, the blood ties of family overcame the legal ties that Diocletian had sought to institutionalize. Constantine's father, Constantius I, had been co-emperor and then emperor in the West. He died in what is today York in England, and his troops proclaimed his son Constantine as emperor. Meanwhile, on again, off again Emperor Maximian named his son Maxentius co-emperor, and things began to get very complicated. At one time, Maximian tried to depose his own son, and even the Eastern Emperor Galerius and his co-emperor Severus II unsuccessfully tried to take on Maxentius. This is the conflict that brought Constantine and Maxentius to the Milvian Bridge, which ended in Constantine's forces winning the battle and Maxentius being drowned in the Tiber River. One of the notable things about the battle is something that happened before the battle itself. Constantine is said to have had a vision, and this vision more closely aligned him with the then growing Christian movement of his time. Lactantius says that the vision came to Constantine in a dream. Eusebius says that Constantine himself told Eusebius that he had a vision of a cross in the sky. So details differ between the accounts of Lactantius and Eusebius, but both involve the phrase, which when translated into Latin is in hoc signo vinces, or by this sign you will conquer. Both accounts also involve the origins of a symbol to be used by Constantine, which in Eusebius is what we now call the Chi-Rho symbol. On the top of the labarum, the standard that the troops carried into battle, Constantine had affixed the Greek letters Chi and Rho, which were the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. And that later became a symbol of the Christianization of Constantine's army and of, you could even say, of Constantine's mission. Constantine didn't formally convert to Christianity until the end of his life, but the Battle of the Milvian Bridge is associated with his first explicit use of Christian symbols, so that the Battle of the Milvian Bridge wasn't only a crucial event in the history of the Roman Empire, it was also an important event in Christian history, and we could say an important event in Christendom. I first read about the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in A.H.M. Jones' book, Constantine and the Conversion of Europe. Constantine and the Conversion of Europe made a deep mark on me, probably because I read it when I was young and impressionable, and I had everything to learn since I was starting from a position of complete naivete. In this book, Jones gave a naturalistic account of Constantine's vision of the cross prior to the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And this kind of naturalism in explaining a traditional story made me aware of what history as a scholarly discipline could do. But first, here's the traditional account of Constantine's vision of the cross from Eusebius's Life of Constantine the Great, chapter 28, which chapter is titled, How, While He Was Praying, God Sent Him a Vision of a Cross of Light in the Heavens at midday with an inscription admonishing him to conquer by that. Eusebius wrote, quote, Accordingly, he called on him with earnest prayer and supplications that he would reveal to him who he was, and stretch forth his right hand to help him in his present difficulty. And while he was thus praying with fervent entreaty, a most marvelous sign appeared to him from heaven, the account of which it might be hard to believe had it not been related by any other person. But since the victorious emperor himself long afterwards declared it to the writer of this history, when he was honored with his acquaintance in society and confirmed his statement by an oath, who would hesitate to accredit the relation, especially since the testimony of aftertime has established its truth? He said that about noon, when the day was already beginning to decline, he saw with his own eyes the trophy of a cross of light in the heavens above the sun, bearing the inscription, Conquer by this. At this sight, he himself was struck with amazement, and his whole army also, which followed him on this expedition and witnessed the miracle. Unquote. That's Eusebius of Caesarea, who not only wrote this Life of Constantine, but also an influential history of the church. There's a providential philosophy of history everywhere present in the work of Eusebius, preceding even St. Augustine, who was born 15 years after Eusebius died, and Augustine's student Orosius, whom Augustine asked to write a history more or less based on Augustine's philosophy of history. Eusebius's providentialism isn't at all subtle. He tells us on every page when God is directly intervening in history to keep things going in the right direction. And in his ecclesiastical history, Eusebius ultimately describes Constantine's triumph at the end of all his battles against the other tetrarchs. Quote, His adversary thus finally thrown down, the mighty victor Constantine, preeminent in every virtue that true religion can confer, won back his own eastern lands and reunited the Roman Empire into a single whole, bringing it all under their peaceful sway in a wide circle embracing north and south alike from east to the farthest west, unquote. Here, the reunification of the empire is treated as an unalloyed good, since now a unified empire is coextensive with a unified Christendom. Eusebius' panegyrics for Constantine get a little over the top, I would say, since he goes on to write, quote, Men had now lost all fear of their former oppressors. Day after day, they kept a dazzling festival. Light was everywhere, and men who once dared not look up greeted each other with smiling faces and shining eyes. They danced and sang in city and country alike, giving honor first of all to God, our sovereign Lord, as they had been instructed, and then to the pious emperor with his sons so dear to God. Old troubles were forgotten, and all irreligion passed into oblivion. Good things present were enjoyed, those yet to come eagerly awaited. In every city, the victorious emperor published decrees full of humanity and laws that gave proof of munificence and true piety. Unquote. I assume that Augustine must have read Eusebius's history, but he doesn't actually cite Eusebius, though Eusebius effectively laid the groundwork for what Augustine would later do. Christian historians and philosophers had reason to emphasize Constantine's vision as a turning point in Christian history and as being a manifestation itself of divine intervention in human history. Later historians would look for naturalistic explanations of Constantine's vision, notwithstanding the conflicting accounts of the vision. So there's the open question of what it is exactly that a naturalistic account is supposed to explain. If we go with Lactantius' account of a dream, it's easy to dismiss. It's just a dream. Eusebius's version of a daytime vision of a cross in the sky, also witnessed by Constantine's army, isn't as easily dismissed, but it's also not documented by any other source. So here's A.H.M. Jones' naturalistic version of Constantine's vision from his book, Constantine and the Conversion of Europe. Quote, what Constantine probably saw was a rare but well-attested form of the halo phenomenon. This is a phenomenon analogous to the rainbow, and like it, local and transient, caused by the fall not of rain, but of ice crystals across the rays of the sun. It usually takes the form of mock suns or rings of light surrounding the sun, but a cross of light with the sun in its center has been on several occasions scientifically observed. The display may well have been brief and unspectacular, but to Constantine's overwrought imagination, it was deeply significant. It was to the sun that he now especially paid his devotion, and in his hour of need, the sun had sent him a sign, and that sign was the cross, the symbol of the Christians. Whatever this signified, that Christ was a manifestation of the unconquered Son, or that the Son was the symbol of the heavenly power whom the Christians worship, it was manifest that Christ, Lord of the cross, was to be his champion and protector. Unquote. None of this is especially revelatory or profound, but to my younger self, it was a model of the rational analysis of a credulous ancient source. And you can say there's a sense in which it prepared me to read Hugh Trevor Roper's quasi-psychoanalytical account of the early modern witch hysteria, which I mentioned in my episode on the Salem witch trials and executions. We have the option of simply downplaying the vision. Several ancient sources mention the Battle of the Milvian Bridge without ever mentioning Constantine's vision. And Gibbon, in his Enlightenment classic on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, doesn't even bother to mention Constantine's vision. Gibbon was intensely interested in the role of religion in the fall of Rome, and he famously said that the fall of Rome was due to the triumph of barbarism and religion. But Gibbon's interest in religion didn't extend to giving an account of Constantine's vision, or even attempting to explain naturalistically how this might have occurred. Probably it's better that he didn't even attempt an explanation. One of the things that's always bothered me about attempted naturalistic explanations of visions or mystical experiences is that they come off in a way that isn't really convincing. In the case of Constantine's vision, there are conflicting accounts, and the accounts we have are pretty sparse on details, so you could say that there is considerable latitude for speculation. But in some cases, the visions are much more detailed and meticulously documented, so that to discuss them with a psychological explanation seems to do violence to the authenticity of the experience. As an example, we could cite the many visions of St. Teresa of Avila, who wrote a great many books about her mystical experiences. And so she recounted her mystical experiences in a great deal of detail. The naturalistic account of a claimed non-naturalistic event usually falls far short, and we feel the inadequacy of it as an explanation. And maybe we become more sympathetic to Gibbon, who simply passed over Constantine's vision in silence. If our standard for a preferred explanation is Occam's razor, it could be argued that the simplest explanation for these experiences is that they are what they claim to be, divinely inspired visions. At least that involves no dubious chain of causality or a failure of self-understanding on the part of the individual reporting the vision. But it's no less unsatisfying. Explaining a vision as being divinely inspired is effectively a deus ex machina, and a full explanation would have to include an explanation of the supernatural forces responsible for the vision. And if we regard these supernatural forces to be inexplicable or ineffable or beyond any explanation, then we haven't clarified anything. If, on the other hand, we hold that the supernatural forces can be adequately explained, this explanation would be much more complex than any naturalistic explanation, and thus would fail the test of Occam's razor. Naturalism is often vulnerable to naively converging on forms of psychologism, that is to say, psychological explanations where psychology isn't really relevant, but is subject to conflation with what is relevant. Psychohistory, as in the work of Bruce Maslish and others, is, in a sense, the embrace of psychologism, but with a clean conscience. And even for someone as skeptical as I am of psychologism, I can imagine a legitimate sphere for psychological explanations in history. Since making my episode on Philippe de Comines, I've been thinking about what differences there are, or what differences perhaps there ought to be, between an account of history that takes account of human nature and, on the other hand, psychohistory. It's not clear where the two overlap and where they diverge. I said in my episode on Comines that he attempts to explain the motivations of past actors in history by appealing to human nature. But how exactly is this different from psychohistory? I suppose I have assumed, without making explicit, that human nature is a broader and more comprehensive conception of psychology, so that psychology is nested within human nature. But since both terms have many meanings, one could just as well hold the opposite and say that human nature is nested within psychology. We could say that psychohistory is based on particular psychological theories, while a recognition of human nature doesn't involve particular theories of psychology, so the two are related as informal precursor to formal expression. The formal expression in terms of explicit psychological theories is more easily falsified, but that's only because by being formalized, it has stuck its neck out and made itself vulnerable. Given this interpretation, psychological explanations of historical events possess virtues that explanations in terms of human nature lack. They are clear, they are explicit, and they are falsifiable. In my episode on Henri Pirenne, I quoted Pirenne as saying, quote, "All historical construction, which amounts to saying all historical narrative, rests upon a postulate, that of the eternal identity of human nature. One cannot comprehend men's actions at all unless one believes in the beginning that their physical and moral beings have been at all periods what they are today. Past societies would remain unintelligible to us if the natural needs which they experienced and the psychical forces which stimulated them were qualitatively different from ours." Unquote. This is, for me, a kind of locus classicus for the value of accounting for human nature in history. I don't agree with everything Poincaré, what an unchained Freudian slip. I don't agree with everything Villain said in this passage, but it clearly makes the case. On a slightly different track, I would argue that Collingwood offers us a somewhat modified version of this, since for Collingwood, history is the reenactment of the thoughts of past actors in history, which means that he's implicitly postulating an identity of human nature through an identity of human thought. You won't be surprised to hear that I've always thought there was an implicit psychologism in Collingwood philosophy of history. And so, being the skeptic that I am, I have looked for ways to value Collingwood's contribution without necessarily following up or what could we say, strengthening the psychological elements that are present. I think that the implicit psychologism in Collingwood could be overcome by transcending the psychological in favor of something more fundamental. Collingwood's conception, as I see it, could be further developed in a couple of different directions. Collingwood's conception of the reenactment of past human thought could be given a more metaphysical interpretation by formulating it in the light of Collingwood's own metaphysics, which he characterized as the search for absolute presupposition. If I can further elucidate this idea, I may attempt to produce an episode about this for Collingwood's birthday next year, fate willing. On the other hand, we could also counter the implicit psychologism of an account of history in terms of human thought by reformulating Collingwood's approach in terms of what Husserl called pure phenomenological psychology. In this development of Collingwood's philosophy of history, the psychology itself is purged and purified, but it would take a lot more work to give a full account of what I'm suggesting here, so that's not in the cards anytime soon. But I did want to mention it as a possibility and something I have in the back of my mind. In any case, however one chooses to interpret Constantine's vision prior to the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, it retains its importance as one of the many events that we could identify as a turning point in history. Whether you see it as the foundation of Christendom, that is to say, Christianity as a civilizational project, or as a triumph of barbarism and religion as Gibbon saw it, either way, it's an event that both demands and resists explanation. So thanks for listening.